So I am really excited to be here. I've been very excited about this conference, and as Steve said, we've been taken very good care of, which has been really lovely, so thank you. And so for the next 40 minutes, I am going to ask you all to take a deep look at your cultures, your work cultures, and to think about how they're impacting your ability to create great work and get it out in the world, and to think about how you might be able to impact or shift your culture. So culture it's a really funny organism. It is something in most of our teams and organizations that grows over time, right? There's a founder who makes some decisions, and there's someone in HR that sets up some policies. There's a creative director that sets up a process. Maybe 5 years later, that process is changed by a new creative director. And many of us inherit legacy cultures, and they feel kind of like that, right? Layers and layers of policies and practices and all these decisions that have been made about how we should work together, often by people who aren't even working there anymore, right? And so I wonder how many of you actually take time in the midst of your busy lives and days to think about that big picture of culture and to think about how it's impacting you. Now, I would guess that the vast majority of you actually spend more time reacting to your cultures than thinking about how to improve them. And we have a lot of really good excuses for that, like, I'm not in a position in my company to really have that kind of influence. Or, frankly, I don't have time. Like, I'm slammed, I just need to get stuff done, this culture thing, I don't have time to deal with that. And those are good excuses, but I would also argue that it would behoove every single person in this room to take a close look at culture, because at the end of the day, it affects your ability to communicate, to collaborate, and to get great work out into the world. It really is one of the keys to your success. So we're going to unpack that today. And during this time together, I would like for you to think of me as your personal cultural therapist. And here's how this is going to work. I am going to first give you a little bit of context for what culture is, how it impacts you, and how you impact it. And then I'm going to talk about 4 characteristics of healthy culture, what that looks like. And I'm going to ask you some questions about your cultures and ask you to think about that a bit. And then I'm finally going to walk you through a 4-step process of sorts for designing a healthy culture. And I'm also going to share with you some inspirational examples of other cultures, other organizations that are doing cool things. So the goal is that you walk out of here with a bunch of fodder, and that hopefully I inspire you to be more aware of where your culture needs improvement, be inspired enough to do something about that, and walk out of here with a place to start. So let's get started. So how is your culture affecting you? Yeah. Let's begin looking at that by looking at what culture actually is, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So culture, it's a big thing, but it basically boils down to 2 things. It's the values and the practices of your team, of your group, or of your organization. And you notice that I put group, team, or organization, and that's because culture actually happens on many scales within organizations. Each project has a unique culture. Each team has a unique culture. And actually, collectively, those things affect the culture of also organizations as a whole. When I talk about values, what I mean is what you have collectively agreed is important. Now, sometimes that is explicit in the form of mission statements, for example, and sometimes that's implicit. So it may not be written anywhere, but you may know that in your culture, for example, that it is valued that it's an environment where it's safe to offer ideas. You may just know that. That's the way that people behave. Which leads me to the second piece, which is practices. So practices are how we practice what we value, right? And the thing is that practices are really kind of where the rubber hits the road, because your practices tell the truth about what you value. So it doesn't matter what your mission statement is if your practices say something very different. And that is where a lot of teams and organizations run into problem. There's misalignment between what they say they want to be about and what they're actually being about in every day. And we'll talk a little bit later about how to get those better aligned. So culture is it's super, super important to teams and organizations for a couple of reasons. One, it affects retention. The reality is that people don't stick around in organizations where they are not happy, where they're not challenged, where they don't feel supported, and they gravitate toward organizations where they are. And it is also very expensive to organizations to have to, deal with that churn of people leaving all the time, right? We all know that. The other piece of culture that I'm particularly interested in and that we're going to kind of focus on today is culture's impact on creativity, on our ability to think, as Steve was talking about, innovatively. Now, that word innovation, I have to say, it's kind of like a non-word. It's like that word that everyone uses, but it's starting to not mean anything anymore, But if you are a group of people who really believe in that and really value that and want to be that in the world, then that means that you have to commit to making the space for that kind of thinking to happen, the psychological space. Because creative thinking, it doesn't just happen in a vacuum, and it certainly doesn't happen in environments that don't nurture it. Here's the interesting thing about that psychological space. It's not just up to management to create it. Every single person in this room is a part of creating that space, because culture is affected by all of us. I talked about how culture happens on many scales. It happens within projects and within teams, for example. Well, that means that all of us are impacting it day to day. It is not just a top-down experience. It happens in all directions. And all of us, essentially, we have the ability to affect culture on one of those scales, and I would argue that actually on more, and I'll give you an example. So at Cooper, where I work, we used to work differently. The design teams they'd get together in a room, and they would brainstorm together, and then they would all go back to their desks, and they would do their part, and then they would come back together, and there'd be some iteration, and they'd go back to their desks, and they'd work some more, this thing, right? Well, there was a team that was working together on a project that was really accelerated. And our teams are small, they're like 4, maybe 6 people. And that team decided to work in a different way. They said, let's take over one of these spare rooms and let's just hunker down in there and let's work together every day in that space as opposed to doing this back and forth thing. So they could put stuff all over the walls, and they were able to collaborate really highly together nonstop. Well, it turned out to be a really effective practice. And the other teams took note of that, and that practice started to spread. Well, fast forward, and it became actually an expectation that when you started a project, you would get a war room. Fast forward to this year, and we moved recently to a new space. And one of the criteria of finding that new space was that it had enough war rooms, potential war rooms available, that every team would be able to have them and they could spread out. So that's an example of a small group of people making a decision to do something differently that really impacted our whole culture. It impacted the way we work, and in fact, it impacted the space that we are now in, which is an awesome space. What I'm talking about is your ability to have a domino effect. I have a friend, Sarah B. Nelson. I don't know if you guys know her, but she is amazing, and she started a company called Radically Human. And she said to me, moments of change string together. I love that phrase. And the point is that we are all capable of influence by osmosis, like the example that I just gave you. But also along with that is the reality that we have to take responsibility for our cultures. If your current culture is challenging, you essentially have 2 choices. You can think of yourself as an influencer, or you can think of yourself as a victim. Or another way of putting that would be change your attitude or change your job, right? Now, that's a little bit harsh, but those are actually both totally valid decisions. I am not advocating for you guys to stick it out in a culture that's horrific and really misaligned and where you feel like there's no hope. I mean, unless you're the kind of person that really loves that kind of challenge, and then go for it, right? But what I am saying is that, at the end of the day, there is no such thing as a perfect culture, and that all cultures get better when the people that are within them take responsibility for their impact. So, to recap, culture is based on values and practices. And your practices really tell the truth of where you are, of what you believe, right? Culture affects your creativity as a team, as a group, as an organization, so it makes a lot of sense to pay attention to it. You have the power to impact your culture, and that culture change really starts with being willing to be the first domino. Now that's part one of our session together. Now let's look at what healthy culture is, because I want to give you a design target, something to aim for. Now the first thing you should know about culture is that there is no magic bullet, there is no one size fits all. Culture is determined by the individuals that are within it, which means you have a lot of power to create. You know, a culture that is highly aggressive and competitive might be fantastic for one group of people. They may actually create amazing work in that kind of environment. You slap it on another, it might be totally crippling. So, you know, it's up to you ultimately. But there is a common goal across many, many organizations, which is to put great products and services out into the world and to make some money doing that, right? Well, there are some characteristics of cultures that make that more possible. Now, thinking about kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think there's also a hierarchy of needs in cultures, right? There's some baseline things that have to happen or your cultures fall apart, like security, job security, you know, knowing that your next paycheck is definitely coming, that there are sales coming through the pipeline, and feeling confident about that. Things like honesty, you know that management and your colleagues have integrity about their word. If those things don't happen, you're going to be in trouble. But there are some things that really differentiate cultures that are kind of just surviving and those that are really thriving. And those are vision, autonomy, inspiration, and chemistry. Now, I'm going to walk through each of these and talk about why they're important, and I'll give you an example of that done well. And I'm also going to ask you to think a little bit for each of these about how that is manifesting in your own team or organization. So vision. Obviously, if everybody on the ship understands where the ship's headed, the crew understands, you're much more likely to get there, right? The great thing about strong visions, though, is not only that they get people there, but they inspire people and they give people purpose, which is really important for motivation. But the other piece is that for vision to be really successful, it also has to work on another level, which is that every single person within the team or the organization, they need to understand how they connect to that vision, how they specifically help move it forward. That's really important. And it's also where I think a lot of visions break down. Now, there is a company that I think has an interesting practice to help people stay connected to that bigger vision, and that company's name is Morningstar. They are the global leader of tomato processing, and they have no managers. And I'm going to keep talking about them throughout this talk, and I'll give you little snippets of what's so interesting about their culture. But they don't have formal management. Everyone negotiates their responsibilities with their peers. And each person has a personal mission statement. So obviously that personal mission statement is aligned with the bigger vision of the organization, but they capture in a couple of sentences their part in pushing that vision forward. And so I ask you to consider for yourselves, do you and your colleagues currently understand your connection to that bigger vision, whether it's the vision of a project or vision of your organization as a whole? And do you have practices in place that help you all stay connected to that throughout projects? Because often we're really good at the beginning, you know, kickstarting, and we're all, yeah, the vision, but like halfway through, we've all forgotten. So think about that. So autonomy is another piece. In the book Drive by Daniel Pink, he talks about how behavioral science shows that we are highly, highly motivated by autonomy. And that the secret to cultivating, high performance in teams is essentially capitalizing upon the reality that we all have an intrinsic need to direct our own lives, and that we have an innate desire for ownership. That's part of our wiring. So the thing that's great about autonomy when it is given to us and when we embrace it is that it inspires intrinsic initiative. Right? It is amazing what groups of people will do if they feel real ownership of something, how the fights that they're willing to fight to make that thing happen. Now, Morningstar, again, another practice that they have in place is that everyone is responsible for getting whatever tools they need to do good work. There's no one that they ask for permission. They don't have to run that budget by anyone. They just do it. So if you need to spend $10,000 on a piece of equipment because it helps you do your job, you just do it, which is not actually a common practice in most organizations, right? It's not, I can't even do that in my organization. So, but this is to get us thinking about the possibilities for how our cultures could operate. And so I ask you to consider, are there practices within your organization, within your team, that really nurture and foster autonomy, that give people a feeling of ownership of some piece of that bigger vision? Okay, so raise of hands. How many of you are dying to create lukewarm ideas that are basically iterations of what you've done before? Right, no. We want to create killer ideas that are really good for business and customers, right? I mean, otherwise, what are we spending all our time on? But here's the thing about great ideas. They don't just happen. They don't happen out of thin air. They happen because there's a lot of hard work, there is experimentation, and there's commitment to a time, place, and space for that kind of experimentation and thinking to happen. An example of that, actually of a couple, is I was talking to Brian, I'm going to say Brian Z. Where is he? Will you say your last name? Shmieski. There we go. I said it like 5 times last night and I still couldn't remember it. Anyways, Brian was telling me that at his company, they have 15-minute Fridays where they have a dedicated time where they do brainstorming and it's all different kinds of things, right? I think the last one you were saying was you guys came up with memes. But the point is that it's a really simple practice where you're getting people in the habit of cultivating inspiration and creativity. There's a place and a space for that. At Cooper, on our design projects, we always have what we call exploration workshops. You may have something similar, you may call it a different name, but there is a dedicated time, place, and space for really divergent thinking and for getting wild ideas out there. And we may do those multiple times throughout a project because we may do that in the beginning and then want to look closer at a particular part of what we're designing and get crazy ideas out there. But the point is that we are committed to fostering that. And so I turn that back to you to consider how good a job are you guys doing right now of cultivating this inspiration, of ways of nurturing that within your teams and organizations. Because frankly, if you are not, there's no way you're going to come up with amazing ideas. It's just not going to happen. Or you might have a one-off, but you're certainly not going to have it repeatedly over time. So chemistry. This one, I think, is often neglected, and there's not enough attention paid to this, but this is essentially how well do you relate with the other people that you are working with as human beings. Now, that might sound frou-frou, but here's why it's important. One is, obviously it makes your experience of working together more enjoyable, which I'm all for. The other piece is that when you hit challenging times in projects, which you always will, right? A stakeholder isn't happy with the current direction, scope creep, whatever it is, there are points where you have to work together to figure out solutions. Design is a collaborative process, right? And if you do not connect as human beings, it will be much harder to come to a solution. It will be a lot harder to get through that stuff. So there are lots and lots of ways to do this in organizations, and they can be very simple. At Cooper, we have lunch together on Wednesday, every Wednesday. Cooper pays for it, which is really great, but everybody goes and we hang out together. I've seen remote teams do this really well, because this is where it's really challenging, right? Because your partner's in other places. Having Skype on a computer in the room all the time that connects to the other project team's room, where they're just sort of an ambient presence in the space, so they feel more like a person. Or like sending your work to each other's printers in your different countries, for example, at the end of the day, so you can see what each other are working on. Or as simple as, if your remote team members come into town, like having drinks with them or going to lunch. And these all seem like simple little things, but they make a huge difference in what it is like to work together, and it really does affect your ability to get work done and get good work done. So, to recap, if you pay attention to vision, autonomy, inspiration, and chemistry, if you nurture those things in your culture, you are likely to have everyone feel happier and more invested. You're going to be more productive. You'll have clearer targets. You will come up with stronger, more creative ideas more often. And you will ultimately be able to get better products and services out into the world more often. So, now for the question that I think you're all really here for, which is, if my culture sucks, can I do anything about it? So here's the good news. The good news is that those of us who work in the design industry are already at an advantage, because we have a lot of tools and ways of thinking that are really, really useful when it comes to designing culture. It's really about taking that lens that you use to design products and services and turning it inward toward your team or organization. I'm talking about treating culture like a design challenge, and there's no reason that you can't do that. So similar to the design process you might use at work to create products and services, I'm going to walk you through a 4-step process that can help you think about how to design culture or redesign culture if you're in one right now. And it involves looking inside at your team and your team or organization to assess your current culture, then looking outside for inspiration in other organizations out in the world, synthesizing all of that to come up with eventually a vision for a new culture, and then coming up with a plan to put that into practice. Here, I'm going to walk you through each step and explain why each is important, and then give you some ideas about how to approach each step. So the first step is assessing your culture. What is going on? Now, for this stage, what's really important is essentially to put your ethnography hats on. Use your design research skills to look at your own team or organization. And the reason that's important, obviously, is because if you don't understand the current state, you're not going to be able to come up with a good solution for a better future. Very simple. So how do you go about doing this? I have a few suggestions. One is to try to put on what I call your vujade hat, meaning it is the opposite of deja vu. I did not come up with that term. It was comedian George Carlin came up with it. But it's essentially, being in this space of, how do I describe this? It's like you're in a place you've been many times before, but feel as if you've never been there before. It's that kind of a mind state, right? So look at your culture as if you have not participated in it. And the reason I bring that up is just so that you can remove your own baggage and you can just see, so you can observe, okay? And then your goal is to look for things that are working that you might want to build upon, and things that are not working that are opportunities for change. Now there's a bunch of ways that you can do this. You could do it over time by having a journal, a daily journal, where you spend 5 minutes a day just writing down observations. And then after a certain period of time, looking back on that and synthesizing and sharing, right? Or you could be more focused about it, and you could have an observation day or observation week. Maybe it's just you, maybe it's you and your team, but you take pictures, you take notes, and you're very intentional about just observing what's going on, gathering data. Some things that you might look for, and this is in no way prescriptive, this is just to jog your thinking about the kinds of things you could uncover. You could look at how conflict happens within your team or organization. And conflict is not always a bad thing. It can be a great thing. But what does it look like in your organization? Are there patterns around what causes conflict? Are there certain people that is typically happening around? Do people know when conflict is resolved? Is there any transparency around it, or is it happening behind closed doors? Or maybe you look at communication. How is information, how are plans shared? What's in the digital world? What's happening in hallway conversations? What's happening in formal meetings? What's happening behind closed doors? How transparent is that? Are there big gaps of knowledge for some people versus others? And you could look at how you socialize. I talk about chemistry. You could look at peer reward systems, or just reward systems in general, like how are people appreciating one another? Is that happening amongst peers, management down? Is it effective? There's a lot there. But the point is, again, you're looking for what's working that I might want to build on and do more with, and what's not working that there's an opportunity for change. Now, once you have assessed your culture and you have that sort of foundation, the next step is to look outside for inspiration. There are a lot of organizations that are doing really interesting things when it comes to culture. So how do you find that out? Well, you could, I would bet that if all of you guys thought about your current network, you would be able to think of at least 1 or 2 people that really love their jobs. And love their jobs not just because of the actual task, the skill, but because of the environment. And you should take them to lunch or go to dinner or get them on the phone and pick their brain. Find out, like, what is it about that culture that is working for you? There might be inspiration for you there. You could also sit down with your team and you guys could all talk about your past experiences at other places. Because I would bet that there are aspects of your previous work experiences that have been great. And you also could do research online, right? If you just look up like some of the top places to work, because there are those lists, there are also lots of articles about those organizations. You can look up Morningstar. There's a great article in Harvard Business Review written by Gary Hamel that's all about their culture. It's where I got a lot of that information. Let's see. Oh, and the other thing is to remember not just to look at organizations that are in your industry or even in the business community, but you can look at, social clubs, faith-based groups, museums, schools, child preschool programs. I mean, there is a lot out there where there are interesting cultures at play. So I'm going to share with you just 4 examples to get you thinking to kickstart your work for you. I talked about vision before. And when Steve Jobs was around, he started a practice around vision called the Top 100 Annual Retreat. And this was essentially, he picked 100 people that, I don't know what his criteria were, but he thought they were important. And I think they were from all different levels of the organization. But he would get them together in a room, and he'd stand at a whiteboard, and he'd say, what are the 10 things we should be doing next? And they would have a conversation, and eventually they would end up with a list of 10 things on that whiteboard. And then he would scratch out 7, and he'd say, okay, we can do these. So the top 3. Now there's a few things that I really like about that practice. One is that there is like absolute clarity about what the vision is. It's like 3 things, right? And human beings are funny with memory, but 3 seems to be a magic number for memory. Also, I like that it is something that happened repeatedly, so it wasn't a one-off, it was an annual thing. And the third thing, and this is the most important, is that there were other people involved in thinking about that vision. So even those who volunteered ideas, and their ideas were scratched out or maybe not even written on the whiteboard, I'm pretty sure that they would be more invested in the final decision around vision because they were a part of the conversation, and therefore also better advocates for it back home in their own teams. Now, you may not be able to, get your company to pay for 100 people to get together in a room. I totally get that. But you could do things like what Morningstar has done, right? You could, on your next project, suggest that, hey guys, why don't we all come up with a personal mission statement for how we're going to forward the vision of this project. Everybody come up with them, write them, and post them where they can be seen. For example, autonomy. So I'm coming back to Morningstar. This is my last time, but they have an amazing culture in that. I mean, it may not work for everyone, but they do a really great job of giving people autonomy. Again, you make decisions about your own equipment and the tools you need. You negotiate what your responsibilities are. And they also have your peers rate you 1 to 20 on how much value you add, which also sounds a little scary, but also probably really good information. And your compensation is driven by where you end up on that bell curve of 1 to 20. So that example could inspire you to start a practice, say on your next project. When it's over, everyone fills out a little form for each other. Not nasty stuff, but like really, how did you help me? What could I have used more help on, for example? Brainstore is an idea factory in Switzerland, and they actually invite teenagers into their ideation process, which is interesting. And they do that because teenagers obviously don't edit in the same way that adults do, and they also are thinking about different things and bringing new ideas into the equation. And what they have found is that mixing the thinking of experts and novices increases the diversity of solutions that they can come up with. Now, back in your organizations, one thing you could do, maybe inspired by this, is think about if you have an exploration workshop practice, or whatever you call it, but some kind of brainstorming, divergent thinking practice in your design process, consider inviting people outside of the design team. I often see that those brainstorming sessions really are just that group, the designers, but you could and you should be inviting at times your sales partners, your development partners, your marketing partners, because you have to remember that these people, one, are not sitting like this with the problem. So they may see it in a very different way, which could be very valuable to you. They also just see the world in a different way. And frankly, I have been in brainstorming sessions, more than one, where the salespeople came up with the best ideas. I'm not kidding. I'm not just telling you that. Anyways, and also in the process, you will get more buy-in for what you ultimately come up with. Again, even if you don't use their ideas, the fact that they've got to be a part of that process will help you in getting your work out into the world. And lastly, at Cooper, we really value having a culture of appreciation. And you can see that in one of our practices, which is we have gambling chips. You get 3 at the beginning of the year. And you can give it to anybody you want in our weekly staff meeting. And you acknowledge them publicly for something that they've done, whether it's help you with something or they just did a rock star job on a project, whatever it is. And that person gets a crisp $50 bill from Cooper, which is kind of a nice little bonus, And if the monetary side of that kind of reward system isn't so possible in your organization, you could do something like another practice we just started recently, which is we give out superpower badges. So you could design like a template for a superpower badge and send it to everyone in your company or your organization and say, whenever someone does something really that really shows a special skill set that they have, you can make up a fun superpower name for them, print it out, and give it to them. I got one for my stalker superpower, which sounds creepy, but it actually is because I'm really persistent about getting my ideas out and getting support, and I kind of am relentless about it. So. Anyway, so those are just some examples. Again, so you did the assessment of your culture, and then you looked outside for inspiration. Those are the kinds of things you can be looking for. Once you've done all of that, the next step is really to think about the kind of culture you want to create or how you want to improve your culture. And the thing is that at this point, you really have all the ammunition that you need to be really deliberate about trying something new, which is really exciting. So the reason that defining your vision is important is because if you haven't defined the face of that, then it's going to be, again, really challenging for you to come up with a plan for new practices that will actually make that vision happen, right? So how do you do this? Well, I can't do a whole workshop on how you create a vision, but what I will say, and actually Steve said it really well, I think it depends partly on whether you are thinking in the scale of incremental change or disruptive change within your organization. So you might have 2 different approaches. If it's incremental, like say you want to make a change on a project, for example, small change in the way that projects are done, maybe that the discussion around vision is an informal conversation at the beginning of a project where everyone brainstorms around, what you would like the experience of working together to feel like, and brainstorm ways to fix that one element that hasn't been working. If you are, on the other hand, doing something, thinking about change on a more disruptive scale, like you want to fix the whole onboarding process for your company, obviously you may need to be more formalized about that. You need to think about who to invite into that conversation. You may need to have a formal brainstorming workshop. But the point is however you go about it, to make the space to get clear about that vision so that you can think really carefully about what your practices are. Because remember, I was talking earlier about aligning your values and your practices. So this is the moment where if you're clear about your values and your vision, you'll be able to come up with really great practices that really do move those forward. So once you have come up with a vision, the next and final step is to create practices. A plan to get there that will make your vision real. And again, this really is where the rubber hits the road. Let's see, and by the time you are at this point, you will already have tons of fodder. You'll already have ideas for what new practices you might want to implement. And it probably will be just a question of deciding which ones and how you might want to adapt them so they'll be more effective in your current culture. But the most important thing in all of this, once you get to this stage, is just to start, to do something, some practice, one new practice on your next project, for example. And think about this, think about culture as there is no one way to do it, so you can experiment with it. You don't have to get it perfect the first time out the door, right? So every project, for example, is an opportunity to try something new. When I was doing a lot of program and project management, that is how I thought about projects. Every project, I was trying a new practice. Another suggestion is that as you start to do this, as you start to try to have an impact on your culture, seek allies. Because obviously, the more people that you can get on board with the ideas you have around changing culture, the more effective you'll be. And share what you're doing. This is really important. Make sure people know what you're up to. Because again, do you remember I was talking about the Cooper War Room example? Well, if nobody knew that that was happening, and granted, we did end up taking over a room, so they would have known it anyways, but if we weren't communicating about that, it would have been very unlikely that anybody would have adopted that change too, right? Along with experimenting, at the end of projects, do a post-mortem. Like if you tried a new practice, get feedback about how it's going so that you can recalibrate and you can think about how to change it and improve it. And most importantly, just keep going, because culture, it really is a creative act. Like you have the opportunity to have impact on it. And I think the other key to this is really thinking of yourself as that first domino. Now, if you go through this process, if you think about, look inside at like what's going on in your culture currently, if you look outside for inspiration, if you come up with a vision and then you start creating some new practices, you are certain to end up in a better place. And the other good news is that you will be in a position of being intentional about your culture rather than being reactive. But our work here is not done. That's not it. There is actually a bigger, badder goal that I would love to inspire you to think about, which is this, which is ultimately trying to have a bigger influence on your organization or your team at large and developing a designing culture practice. That means getting other people on board for what you're up to. I mean, I want you to imagine like what would be possible if everybody that you worked with really saw and took responsibility for their impact on culture. And if they saw culture as a design challenge, if everybody was thinking about it that way, imagine the amazing vision that you would be able to come up with collectively and the killer new practices that you can't even think of right now in this room that you would be able to generate. Like imagine how strong a culture you would be able to create if you had that kind of investment, right? So I really do have confidence that you can get there. Culture change, it takes time, so it isn't something that's just gonna, it's a long game and you have to be real about that. But I have seen too many examples of people influence their culture at all different levels of organization. So I know that you can do that. We've covered a lot today. So I wanna leave you with the 3 most important things, because I wouldn't be a good speaker if I didn't do that. One is that culture comes from your values and practices. And remember, your values really tell the truth, right? 2 is that healthy culture draws great talent, keeps them there, and inspires them to really think creatively. So it's something that we should be paying attention to. And 3rd is that every single person in this room has the power to impact your work cultures right now. So I encourage you to go forth, make culture, embrace your role as culture creators, and let me know how it goes. And I'm here to answer questions if you would like at the break.